Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the British Institute of International and Comparative Law for the ICLQ Annual Lecture. I'd like to apologise. I'm clearly not Sir Malcolm Evans. Unfortunately, he's not able to be with us tonight for personal reasons. So instead, luckily, the ICLQ has two co-general editors. The other, Professor Spyros Maniatis, who's also the Bickle Director, is here to help me chair it. And I, if you're wondering, am Anna Riddle-Roberts, the managing editor of the ICLQ. Malcolm sends his sincere apologies. He was very much looking forward to presenting this evening, given that the two speakers are obviously esteemed colleagues of his from the University of Bristol, and particularly also that our early career prize recipient works in the field of the law of the sea, which is his own field, of course. He was very much looking forward to a little chat with her, but she's unfortunately going to have to make do with me. And I apologize in advance, but law of the sea is not my field. I hope you won't be able to tell. So the ICLQ Annual Lecture, I think this is the 12th now, was started in 2011 to celebrate 60 volumes of the journal. And we hold it every year to showcase the breadth and depth of subjects that we cover within the journal within the preceding 12 months. This year it was a very easy selection, because I think this has probably been one of our most downloaded articles ever. So we have here with us Professors Phil Syrpis and Clair Gammage from the University of Bristol and now the University of Exeter, respectively. I will start with the Early Career Prize, and then I'll hand over to Professor Maniatis, who's going to introduce the two of them and their subject properly. But first, I have the honour of introducing you to Francis Angardi, who is this year's Early Career Prize winner. Once again, this was an exceedingly easy choice. It's very rare that we get an article submitted that makes it all the way through peer review and everybody agrees that it's an accept as is. And Francis' paper was one of those very rare occasions, so it was an obvious choice for our Early Career Prize for this year. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Sydney, and her subject, her article is What States Say and Do About Legal Stability and Maritime Zones and Why It Matters. Francis and I are going to have a quick chat about the substance of her article and her research generally. And normally at that point, we would present a physical prize to her in the form of a certificate and £250 worth of books that Cambridge University Press very generously supply as her physical prize. But given that she's in Sydney, we are going to skip that part. But Rebecca O'Rourke from Cambridge University Press is here with us this evening. They've generously supported our reception following this event and also the prize. So if you join me perhaps in thanking them for their continued support of the journal. So Francis, you can all see her clearly there. Climate change clearly and its many manifestations are raising many questions and challenges for the international legal order. Your article documents how states have begun to give an increasing prominence to legal stability for maritime zones in the face of sea level rise. Why is this an issue?
Thanks so much, Anna. Can I just check that that's coming through clearly enough for people in the room?
Yes.
Lovely, thank you. Maybe if you don't mind, before I respond to your question, can I just quickly give a big thanks to Bickle and ICLQ and also to Cambridge University Press, to yourself, Anna, and also to Professor Evans. It's just so wonderful to see early career research being supported in this way. And certainly I've had many discussions with others at the University of Sydney about how wonderful it is to have a dedicated recognition of early scholarship. So just wanted to put that out there and to acknowledge how grateful, not just myself, but I guess the cohort is of having that opportunity. And yeah, I'm especially sorry not to be able to join you in person today. I did for a short time, actually live quite near Russell Square, where I believe you are right now. So I'm feeling particularly nostalgic about that time. So anyway, thank you very much. With that short thanks, maybe I'll come back to answer your question. So why are states talking about legal stability in maritime zones? Well, it's something which has come up as a concern in the international community, and increasingly voiced in UN settings, but also in regional settings, about states wishing to preserve their exclusive economic zones, their fishery zones, their zones of sovereign jurisdiction in the oceans, which are perceived by many to be at risk of reduction or loss as a result of sea level rise. So this has come up in discussions in the UN General Assembly, where states have called for the preservation of their maritime zones in the face of sea level rise. We've also seen it before the UN Security Council just last month. And it's also come up in, I guess, more specific fora, for example, Commonwealth heads of government, and also within the Pacific. And I started wondering, well, okay, so states are clearly giving increasing prominence to this idea of stability for maritime zones. Why is this necessary? Why is it necessary to actually make a statement that such zones will be preserved? And the reason for that is under the International Law of the Sea, which is the body of public international law, as many of you will know, under which maritime zones are established, the rules provide that states have an ability to assert maritime zones in certain circumstances, and that is mainly where maritime zones flow from land. And so where a state has sovereignty over land territory, it has an entitlement to declare certain maritime zones. And so the question arises then, if there are impacts to the land, such as erosion or inundation as a result of sea level rise, then what might be the legal implications of those effects on the maritime zones which have already been declared? Is it the case that they would shrink, or that they might be lost altogether? So that's what states were concerned about.
Thank you. So your article explains how some scholars have approached this issue so far, and the prevailing view seems to have been that they adopt an ambulatory view of baselines under international law. Could you explain for our audience who may not be familiar with law of the sea, and also for me, what this means and how your approach in your article differs from that?
Yeah, and an ambulatory theory of baselines is the view that the baseline of a maritime zone, that is the starting point along the coast from which a maritime zone is drawn, so 200 nautical miles, for example, from a baseline. This idea of ambulatoriness is that the legal baseline is identified or coterminous with the coastline, specifically the low water line along the coast. And here I'm talking about the most common type of baseline, the normal baseline. There's lots of different types, but we'll just talk about this one. And so the idea then is, if there are changes to the coastline, then an ambulatory baseline would mean that automatically there will be changes to that baseline as well. So if we see the low water line along the coast come a little bit landward, then that will also bring the legal baseline landward. And this was the view that was held by many scholars for a few decades, and many still now. And I was wondering about this because it really was at odds with the view that is widely held among states as to stability. So which is the case? Is it that they ambulate, or that they can be stable? So that was what then prompted me to investigate what states do, a question of state practice as a matter of international law, to actually look at examples of what they do in their legislation. And in the article, I actually put some of that evidence in there to demonstrate that there's a whole diversity of ways in which states actually proclaim their normal baseline, some of which are ambulatory, but most of which are what might be called fixed, for example, by describing a baseline by say, geographic coordinates. Baselines that are described in that way are actually stable and don't move when the coastline moves. So that was something that I really tried to incorporate in that article, that element of what states practically do about this issue.
Thank you. So do you have any observations on how that process of actually looking at state practice as well as what states are actually saying speaks to the conduct of international law scholarship more broadly? I mean, what are the key takeaway points that you'd like people to draw from your article?
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I guess maybe just a few things briefly. Firstly, that looking at what states say, I think was really important, not just to evaluate the political import of the statements that were given by states, but also, I guess, to reveal a line of inquiry as to an aspect of scholarship which had actually gone understudied, and that was to look at how states actually pursued stability in their actions. So that's the first thing, that looking at what states say illuminated an understudied area which needed further attention. I guess the second thing I'd say is then using that as a springboard to go ahead and look at that state practice was a worthwhile thing to do, if also a little bit difficult, I should say, looking at the legislation of over 150 coastal states. But actually it was a really worthwhile thing to do because it made visible this pattern of diverse implementation of international law, which otherwise hadn't been visible. And then I guess the convergence of those two things, what states say and do, are, as many people in the room will know, potentially legally significant as a matter of the treaty interpretation of the law of the Sea Convention, as matters of subsequent practice and potential agreement of the parties as to interpretation. So this conversion of those two elements of research actually were brought to bear for our understanding of how the law of the sea should be interpreted.
Thank you. Well, I imagine everyone in the room now can see why we were so very impressed with your research and how you presented it in the article, raising such interesting and novel points. Now that you have elevated your career so highly with this esteemed prize, what are your future plans after your PhD? Where do you think you might take your research next?
Thanks, Anna. It's a tricky question. Actually, one of the things that I'm really keen to explore is this idea that maritime zones flow from land, which people might have heard that it comes from the principle that the land dominates the sea. In my research, I've looked a lot at the experience of Pacific Island countries, and a concept that I learned in that context is the concept of sea people. A Pacific scholar had described it as sea people as an understanding that the oceans are not subsidiary to a connection to land, that actually a connection of people to the sea is a primary one for sea people. And it did occur to me that, oh, how does that understanding of the relationship between people, sovereign rights and oceans actually connect with the principle that in the law of the sea, that the land should dominate the sea? And so this is one aspect that I'm looking into as to how do these things connect? Is it possible that there may be a shift or a further nuancing in the law of the sea to accommodate a more, I guess, global view of the relationship between land and sea? And I guess from an Australian perspective as well, we're seeing an increasing recognition of sea country, which people may have heard, which is a way that Australian Indigenous people would refer to their relationship to the ocean spaces connected to their traditional homelands. And again, this is a similar idea about challenging the dominance of land or the exclusivity of land as being the root of title. And this is another dimension that I'm hoping to look at in terms of how that bears upon these traditional principles in the international law of the sea.
Fantastic, thank you. I have to admit I wasn't familiar with the resurgence of the term sea people. So when you mentioned it to me, I was thinking you were considering talking about ancient Phoenician warrior peoples, and I'm quite relieved to hear that you're not. That certainly sounds like an incredibly interesting study, and I think we hope that one day you might consider publishing it with us, because it certainly sounds like something that we'd be interested in. On behalf of everyone here, I'd like to offer my congratulations to you one more time on an excellent article and a very interesting presentation here today. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you. I will hand over to Professor Maniatis now to introduce our lecturers.
Thank you. One of the perks of being director of the Institute is that I'm the substitute of Malcolm in terms of the ICLQ. So as a substitute, I want to thank Malcolm and Anna for running the show really so admirably, efficiently, and effectively. I also want to thank Anna O'Rourke for being the perfect publisher, the perfect intermediary between Rebecca O'Rourke for being the perfect intermediary between the journal and CUP. And I want to congratulate Frances, if Frances is still there, because yes, it was a brilliant article, it was straightforward, but the competition for getting there, being the chosen article is fierce. We do get some great articles. And I'm grateful to my fabulous and fiercely independent editorial boards that take their job very seriously. Every meeting is a revelation for the substitute. So thank you. I'm grateful to all for making the ICLQ what it is. Now, it was a difficult job. We agonized over which will be the perfect article for this year's lecture. There were very good articles that we had to choose from, but this one was straightforward for a number of reasons. It was very good quality. It was well written, easy to read for the non-specialists, very thoroughly researched, quality, excellent. It has huge impacts, zillions of downloads, we'll exaggerate maybe, but thousands of downloads. And also it contributed to an ongoing conversation about a topic that keeps on coming back. And the two authors are very active in making sure that there is that conversation. So we have two serious academics that are also influencers in terms of making, helping this conversation continue, not only amongst the specialists, not only amongst the academics, but the real world that I think is important. And finally, as a trademark lawyer, I'm a trademark lawyer, I think they have chosen the perfect title, Sovereignty Fictions in the UK's Trade Agenda. Now, delete trade and, replace with Gary Lineker, replace with football, replace with food, with the environment, with electric cars, with banking, with everything. So I would suggest that they register this title as a trademark for everything, all goods and all services in all classes, because this is something that will keep on going. So congratulations. I'm grateful that you chose ICLQ and you lead now. I think Phil starts and Claire follows. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much indeed. Huge honor to be here. I'm delighted that the editors seem to like the piece so much and appreciate the amount of downloads that it's apparently had. We decided to give this lecture in 3 sections. First, I will talk about the genesis of the article and say a little bit about sovereignty. Then Claire will move on to talk about regulatory sovereignty in particular and the global Britain agenda. And then I will end with a few words on the Windsor framework and the way the Northern Ireland Protocol is being resolved, if that's what is happening. Start with the genesis of this article and what kind of inspired us to write it. Essentially, it was the ubiquity of the sovereignty narrative. As Spiro says, it is everywhere, and the view of the government and the government supporters is that Brexit has finally given the UK its sovereignty. Even among those who might be more questioning about the merits of Brexit, the focus tends to be on the economic effects which Brexit has had. And it seems to be accepted that Brexit has given the UK a measure of sovereignty. And this is a view with which we disagree. Also, we both, from very different perspectives, written about sovereignty before. So I've been concerned, and there's a little bits of this in the article, about the ways the EU has dealt with sovereignty in its development. Claire's written about sovereignty in the WTO context. We first wrote a blog on the LSE Brexit blog in 2020, talking about sovereignty as a political emotion, and that then gradually morphed into this article. So, summarizing the article, we focus on the performativity of the sovereignty narrative, problematizing the many ways in which the UK government has justified post-Brexit decision-making based on sovereignty. So our arguments about sovereignty fictions show that the freedom to set one's own trade rules comes at a significant cost. And in any event, that the notion of absolute sovereignty in the contemporary global context is fiction. The very real risk is that the UK has, at every stage in the Brexit process, sought to exchange the real power which it had to shape European and global standards for something more illusory and ultimately probably unsatisfying. So we wanted to highlight the role that sovereignty fictions have played in mystifying stakeholders about Brexit, and to highlight the disconnect between the absolutist version of sovereignty popularised in the UK's political rhetoric and the concept of regulatory sovereignty that underpins the UK's future trading strategy. So in the article, we explore the diverging approaches to regulatory sovereignty taken by the EU and the UK in the post-Brexit landscape, and we illustrate the blind spots in their approaches that may end up undermining their efforts to retain their status as global powerhouses. So the idea of sovereignty fictions was first popularised by the late Professor John H. Jackson in relation to the WTO. So it refers to concepts of sovereignty that do not accurately reflect what's really going on in the world. And we chose to focus on the sovereignty fictions identified in the ongoing post-Brexit trade contexts. And they're essentially an independence fiction and an allocation of power fiction, an idea that sovereignty isn't insular, but rather it's relational. And we conclude by arguing that the notion of absolute sovereignty can no longer be used accurately to capture or define state interactions in the contemporary global economy. Essentially, the proposition at the heart of the article is simple, that sovereignty isn't absolute. And in this respect, we're not making a new or particularly bold claim about sovereignty. I think the point of the article is that we've sought to demonstrate the real dangers associating with perpetuating falsehoods about sovereignty during and after Brexit. And that's why I think in the article we focus, or we combine, academic accounts of the development of sovereignty with political rhetoric, and the rhetoric which is used to justify particular, and to frame particular policy choices. So in this lecture, we'll say a little bit more about how our ideas about sovereignty intersect with contemporary global challenges, in particular the Global Britain Agenda, and more specifically the Windsor Framework. I'll just say a few more things about sovereignty before passing on to Claire. So what is sovereignty? How do we understand sovereignty? And it is, in part, and this is the absolutist version of sovereignty, about notions like independence, freedom from constraint, the ability to exclude others and others' laws from one's territory, the ability to be free from any external meddling and interference. And that I think is the sum of what the absolutist version of sovereignty amounts to. But our claim is that this is not a complete account. And it's clear that the right to exclude and to be independent and free from constraints, etc., coexists with the right to be recognized as an autonomous agent in the international system, capable of interacting with other states, capable of entering into international agreements. Why is this important? Because I think, and hopefully we took an uncontroversial starting point, which is to go back all the way to John Locke. Sovereignty can be understood as the ability to control outcomes and for a government to respond to the fundamental needs of the people. And I think the issue is that as the world has become more interdependent, and it's very clear that it has become more interdependent with time, the ability of nation states and or their governments to respond to the fundamental needs of their peoples depends on international cooperation and on cooperation between the public sector and the private sector. So on interdependence, I think it's obvious, but we can think about the extent to which goods and people move across boundaries. We can think about the creation and the workings of the WTO and an international regime for trading goods. And we can also think about, not just Gary Lineker, a whole list of other challenges with which the world has faced in recent years. So COVID, I think, exposes some sort of need for international cooperation. We can think about the responses to the war in Ukraine. We can think about the migration crisis, and we can also think about the climate crisis. And in all of these things, a government cannot achieve the goals that it wants to achieve unless it is prepared to act in cooperation with others. I was listening to debates in Parliament yesterday, and one of the interesting points, this was made by David Lammy, the shadow Foreign Secretary, is that the interdependence in the world is in the process of being weaponized, and this was in the context of the UK's defence review and future foreign policy. I think that's also an interesting idea, that the world is becoming more interdependent, and if you are more interdependent, you are more vulnerable to the various actions that other states might take that can affect your peoples. Nevertheless, I think, having said all that, applying the language of sovereignty to cooperation among states is difficult and perhaps even counterintuitive. And that there is a section in the article which talks about the experience of the EU, which I've written about this in more positive terms before, but it sought to reimagine or transform or disaggregate sovereignty. And I think it's fair to say that those sort of accounts that the EU has tried to develop to explain its functioning haven't had the sort of resonance, and certainly haven't had the popular resonance which absolutist sovereignty has had in the UK over the last sort of 10 years or so. I think ultimately it may be best for the language of sovereignty perhaps to be abandoned, and for us to sort of start to think about the way the relationships between states operate sort of without using the language of sovereignty. But the point of this particular article was to look at the sovereignty rhetoric of the government and to problematize the concept of sovereignty. So a few quotes just to end this bit from me about the way we understand sovereignty. So this is from Anne-Marie Slaughter first. If the new sovereignty is the right and the capacity to act in international regimes, networks and institutions, then becoming or being a sovereign state would mean the participation of as many government officials as possible in plurilateral, regional and global government networks. Sovereignty could be said to describe a capacity to engage rather than a right to resist. And however paradoxical it sounds, the measure of a state's capacity to act as an independent unit within the international system depends on the breadth and depth of its links to other states. And I think there's something to be said, or there's a lot to be said for all of those things. So absolute sovereignty, we argue, cannot any longer be used to accurately capture and define state interactions in the contemporary global economy. the negotiation of participation in trade agreements, which are a core part of the UK's global agenda, necessitate constraints on absolute state power. So what I will do is hand over to Claire, who will discuss regulatory sovereignty and the diffusion of power away from the state. Thank you.
Yeah, so just to reiterate, thank you very much for having us here with you this evening. And part of my interest in this comes from my fascination with trade relations and with the idea of how the UK was going to fit into this post-Brexit world. And so looking at sovereignty as an expression of power and this rhetoric that we were seeing in the policy circles, in political narratives of absolutism, as someone with an interest in trade law, this is just something that simply doesn't work, and we know that. So part of this was just really debunking myths around this Brexit and post-Brexit trading landscape. And to do that, we thought actually we could look at regulatory sovereignty as one expression of sovereignty that a country can use or a government can use to assert itself on the global stage, but also to demonstrate how this is a relational concept. It's not insular. You absolutely cannot engage in trading partnerships from an absolutist point of view. It has to be relational. So regulatory sovereignty, or an expression of that, was a way for us to illustrate the interdependency that exists between states as they cooperate with one another, and to rebut that power of allocation of power sovereignty technique that we were seeing coming out from the discourse of the government. Regulation, by its very nature, requires cooperation from lots of different stakeholders. It's not even just government to government, it's private actors and public actors. It can be, outside of the state and within the state. So to regulate or to have regulatory autonomy or regulatory sovereignty, by its very nature, necessitates the interactions of different stakeholders together in that particular space. And I'm just going to walk through some of the themes that were coming out at the time when we wrote this article from different government agencies and different departments around how they were envisaging regulatory space to be defined going forward, and to sort of hint at where we seem to be going at the moment. And I suppose I should start with the main point here is that my personal view is that what we see at the moment is the UK mimicking an awful lot of the EU's behaviours in these spaces. So this idea of absolutism doesn't really exist, and even if it does, it's absolutism but based on a mimicking of another regional approach. So regulatory sovereignty then, for us, is an expression of sovereignty that includes both the ability to exclude, but also to cooperate. You're defining your regulatory space, what you will or will not permit to come into your country, but by doing so, you're also cooperating with others to agree what can or cannot come into your country. And in trade terms, tariffs are generally well liberalized around the world. So really it's non-tariff measures that play a key role now in defining the things that come in and out of a country. In terms of globalization and the way that this has impacted the way countries behave with one another, we see the intrusiveness here of regulatory disciplines, the extraterritorial effects that regulations can have on other legal orders, and the way that this can constitute hidden protectionism, for example, a way that it can bolster a state's position within the global economy. And so regulatory governance is an area that's becoming increasingly important, and it's an area that we really need to sort of start focusing on a little bit more. And part of the challenge that we saw in piecing this article together is rebutting those overly simplified accounts of sovereignty. Now, there are different approaches within the WTO context and indeed within the EU context around the way that countries cooperate and what regulatory autonomy or sovereignty might mean. And we see within the EU single market, for example, a much higher level of coherence that is required amongst those states than we see in the WTO context. That's to be expected. You've got a completely different setup there of an organization and a regional grouping. But what we do see, and what interests me, is the way in which the EU has mobilized its pooled sovereignty to create a really powerful trading entity on the global stage. And when you think that 84% of global growth will happen outside of the EU, that shows you just how powerful the EU is, because it's still nevertheless one of the most powerful actors within the global economy. So how has it got here? And why has this sort of pooled approach to its sovereign expression worked? Well, in part, the EU's approach to regulatory sovereignty has required that its member states remove barriers. They have to remove barriers and they have to align. That is a core part of it. So in and of itself, the EU's regulatory approach internally requires states to cede some of their sovereignty. They have to in order to be part of the bloc. And there's been a focus in the EU framework on risk management, risk regulation, proportionality. These are key things that underpin the high standards that the EU requires of its member states to protect its space. We see things like the better regulation agenda. They're constantly revising that. The institutions of the EU work a lot around this area. And our most recent iteration of EU policy is the open strategic autonomy model. And this is quite a nice expression of regulatory sovereignty, actually, because it's defined by this ability to include and exclude, to define its space by exclusion and cooperation. Now, throughout Brexit, the UK government has asserted it's not going to take that approach, that it's going to go it alone. It's an independent trade actor and it doesn't need anybody else. But what we're actually seeing, if we look through the most recent iterations, there have been shifts in the UK's rhetoric, particularly in its policy documents and its outward-facing foreign policy strategies. We're certainly seeing now a shift to more relational concepts of sovereignty. So if you look at the integrated review of foreign and security policy, where trade is a pillar of that, you can see that actually they're talking about relationships with other countries, the need to cooperate, which signals in itself a shift away from this absolutist approach that we've seen. There's talk about embedding other countries within the UK's network of liberty. There's these lovely expressions that come out that are very evocative about the way that we should pull more countries into the orbit of freedom. Now, this in itself shows that we're bringing more countries in. We want to cooperate. That's not the language that was being used, even just a year ago. So we're already seeing a shift towards the language that we've seen through Anne-Marie Slaughter's work on networks. This is about networking, it's diffusion of power. There's a recognition that other stakeholders will also need to be involved in the process. And there's an acknowledgement of that through the UK's foreign policy documents and indeed through its international development strategy. And we're seeing this rolling out through the Global Britain agenda in general. Now, in terms of the Global Britain agenda, which is still ongoing, we're seeing sort of a relaxation perhaps of this going it alone. We see that there is a new era for UK trade policy. We're seeing trade agreements being proposed with quite controversial partners, for example, partners that were not EU partners. But what we can see is that this is, in a way, the UK's expression of its independence and of its sovereignty to choose whom it will trade with. We have different types of agreements in place at the moment. The continuity or rollover agreements are very simply those agreements that existed before Brexit. They've been rolled over. A few of them have had some tweaks. They may have had additional sort of side agreements put within them. But in general, it rolls it over. They replicate the EU's position, and we see some sort of signaling that things might change in some of the others. What we're also seeing is the proposal to agree new agreements with places like the US, with India, with the Gulf states. And these are proving very controversial. And we're also seeing the desire to accede to CPTPP. So that's a massive mega regional trade agreement in Asia. Now, within this and within these trade agreements, there will be different regulatory standards. So the UK's expression of regulatory sovereignty really does matter because this will dictate the terms on which it can agree these agreements. Now, we had a really interesting account from the aptly named TIGA group last year, in 2021, around what regulation was going to look like in the UK. What was the outward-facing approach going to be like? And unsurprisingly, this reinforced this diffused or network-based approach to sovereignty with a primary role for regulators within it. But it also received a really lukewarm response from regulators and from stakeholders. They weren't convinced with what the UK was saying. Why not? Well, because it actually didn't really seem to be saying anything new. It seemed to be replicating a lot of what already existed. And this idea of deregulation that it was really pushing didn't seem to land well with the private sector. So what we've seen now is a sort of gap, as we've seen lots of different shifts in the political parties and in political leadership, And as we try to now sort of identify where's Britain going next in its trade policy and in terms of its sovereign expression of that policy and around regulation, well, yes, the UK could have different trade agreements with different trade partners, and they could have different regulatory standards. That in itself would be an expression of its regulatory sovereignty, but it creates a very messy and complex situation for the UK's businesses and for the government in terms of how you manage that. We're seeing similar challenges facing the UK and the EU in terms of exercising their power. You know, internally, there are challenges that don't seem to be wedded to what they're doing externally. We've now got the Department for Business and Trade, which has been recently launched, which will hopefully try and bring some coherence here for the UK between the external trade policy and the internal industrial policy. How that will fit with this new regulatory approach that is apparently a common law regulatory approach that prioritizes proportionality, we don't know, but this is the signals that we're getting. We know that the UK is maintaining its position in the economy as a good actor. There's lots of rhetoric within these documents around it becoming a soft power superpower. It's going to be a force for good. This is what it wants to do. So presumably, if we interpret regulation in that particular policy language, that means that regulation will remain high, that we will have high standards, and that in reality, we will need to rely on others and to cooperate with others, which signals interdependency, and it shifts away from absolutist sovereignty, because you have to work with others for that to work. So in sum, what we see throughout this new sort of expression of the Global Britain agenda as it evolves is that the three fictions that we talked about in this paper, the idea of independence, this allocation of power, and the way in which these work with one another, are still fictions. They're just not true. They don't represent what is really happening in the world. The new trade agreements and the disciplines within those trade agreements, many of which are regulatory, show that the UK does not have an absolutist sovereign approach to its agreements or to the way it's negotiating them. And that we see that in this post-Brexit environment, the UK government, I think reassuringly at least, is almost recognizing that this political narrative is flawed, deeply flawed, and that actually to maintain its position in the global economy, it must by necessity cooperate, and that will require interdependence with others in the realities of economic and regulatory governance. So with that in mind, we thought we would finish with the light topic of the UK's relationship with the EU, and give some sort of closing remarks around what we see with the Windsor framework and what this means in terms of some of the arguments that we foregrounded in our article around sovereignty. So I'll hand back over to Phil.
Thank you very much. So the Northern Ireland Protocol and now the Windsor framework. I feel I've been talking about the Northern Ireland Protocol for too long. So maybe the new framing of the Windsor framework will sort of make it feel a little bit newer for me. Essentially, the protocol existed, or the arrangements exist, in order to address, and both the EU and the UK agree with this, the unique circumstances on the island of Ireland. I've found it really useful to think about the issue in the form of a trilemma. So there are three promises which the UK and the EU have made, and it is impossible to meet all three. Three promises being: first, to leave the single market and diverge from EU law, so that the EU and the UK are in different regulatory spaces. Second, that there is no border across Ireland, so there's no border between the EU and the UK. And third, that there is also no border between GB and NI, so you end up with different regulatory spaces which are somehow separated by a lack of border anywhere. Essentially, and it took some time to get here, but two of the promises are pretty much intact. So it is clear that there won't end up being a border across the island of Ireland, and it is also clear that the UK is going to diverge in significant ways from EU law. So that means that you end up with the tension being on the border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the tension strongly felt in particular by, I think, the unionist community in Northern Ireland as a result. So what we've been or what has been going on is that we're arguing about various ways in which it may or may not be possible to de-dramatize, to use Michel Barnier's word, the border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Going back to sort of our article and our framework about sovereignty, there are, I think, essentially two main ways in which the border could be de-dramatized. You could have substantial regulatory convergence or alignment between the UK and the EU, well short of single market membership, but the more you're prepared to align and to have standards that connect with each other, the less need there is for intrusive border infrastructure. Or you could come up with various ways to do checks, surveillance, etc., so as to try and ensure that UK goods which do not meet EU standards are not able to access the EU single market, although there is still no border infrastructure between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland. I think that's where the debate is at. What I think is interesting probably is what the political objections to those two solutions are. So the objection to greater convergence and alignment mainly comes from the ERG and the other extreme groups in the Conservative Party who aren't prepared to countenance this degree of cooperation, if you like, with the EU. Whereas the objection to border checks, surveillance, etc., comes more strongly from the DUP. I think when push comes to shove, the DUP would probably be prepared to accept some degree of alignment if it meant that the border infrastructure and the border checks would be less intrusive. And I think if it came to it, the ERG would probably accept some degree of border infrastructure between GB and NI, so long as that meant that there was no need to converge with EU law. But either way, whichever solution you go for, and whether you end up disappointing the ERG or the DUP, solutions to ways of de-dramatizing the border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland depend on the breadth and depth of the UK's links and its ability to cooperate with the EU. But if we agree standards with the EU, there is less need for a border. Even if we haven't been able to agree standards, if we have a border or are prepared to share data, if we're able to convince the EU that the wrong products won't end up in their market, then we might have a way of de-dramatizing the Irish border. And I think it's interesting that under both the Windsor Framework and the Northern Ireland Protocol, the EU are to some extent taking a leap of faith in that they are relying on the enforcement of agreed rules by the UK, either in GB or in Northern Ireland. And that's something that the EU will find it very much difficult to control. Another thing maybe worth mentioning is the Stormont break, which was part of the Windsor Framework. And under that, new or amended EU rules can be vetoed so that they will not end up applying in Northern Ireland. The veto can be generated by 30 MLAs at Stormont that then has to be endorsed by the UK government. This is seen by some as a big democracy or sovereignty win. Essentially, the people of Northern Ireland can reject new EU legislation if they don't like it. One of the things that hasn't been said so much is that there will be trade consequences if the Stormont break is applied. And these trade consequences haven't been fully sketched out. So the UK's command paper says merely that it will be a matter for the EU how to deal with the consequent impact on their market, and this includes the ability to take appropriate remedial actions. So if the break ever does end up being used, we'll end up finding more about the way in which the system will work and more about the trade-offs which will inevitably be involved. We did this in relation to the article itself, so it's probably worth doing it in relation to this. So look at some of the rhetoric around the Windsor Framework. It will not surprise anyone that for some people, especially on the right of the Conservative Party, the Windsor Framework still doesn't cut the mustard, I think was the phrase which was often used. Although it does, and I think this is a significant win for them, it does give Northern Ireland a significantly greater freedom to diverge from EU rules than it was under the initial protocol. I'll quote David Frost without comment. His objection was that another country has a say over what happens in our country. Equally sort of common among this group is a claim that it was the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill which forced the EU to make concessions to the UK. Again, it's very difficult to prove this one way or another, but as part of this package, the UK has agreed not to proceed with the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. The EU also announced that it would stop the 7 legal actions which were launched against the UK, and I find it very difficult to believe that that isn't a political environment which may be more conducive to future cooperation and to solutions being found, rather than an approach which relies on the power of the UK to reject everything that the EU had to offer. So there is still a quite significant absolutist rhetoric there in the background, but I think that these sorts of, there are tentative signs. I find it difficult to know how strong they are, especially in the events after the events of this last week in relation to immigration, etc. But there are some tentative signs that these voices are being marginalised and that the UK government has distanced itself in some way from them. This is a quote from Andrew McCormick, who's a leading Northern Ireland civil servant. So the rhetoric on these issues was never founded in reality. Complete removal of controls or even information requirements on goods entering Northern Ireland would be incompatible with the commitment to an open land border. The key difference now is that the controls are risk-based and proportionate rather than the standard application of EU rules for the management of a third country border. And I think that's a fair summary of where the UK is at. Another thing to point out is that there is a lot of friendly cooperative rhetoric in the various documents which landed with the Windsor framework. And again, I've a slight doubt about this because I'm not sure whether it's rhetoric which sort of masks the reality of what's going on, or whether it's a rhetoric which we should take seriously. But for instance, in there it says both sides are committed, firmly committed to a positive, constructive relationship as partners with a shared desire for positive bilateral relationship now and into the future. There's a palpable sense that cooperation with the EU might enable the government to unlock other policy areas which have been causing it difficulty, for instance, in relation to the small boats crossings and the ability to find, to make return agreements with the French and with the EU more broadly. I think there is still a significant way to go before we're sure that the UK has sort of learned all the lessons and has gone down a cooperative route. But there are signs that even in relation to its relationship with the EU, there has been a change of position and a move towards what we would think of as a more realistic stance. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to say, in that context, I think that the shifting narrative we've seen has in part been because of the realities of the post-Brexit landscape. And so if you look at trade flows going in and out of the UK, the EU is still our biggest trade partner. The EU countries are still really significant to the UK. And this idea that we could diverge in a regulatory way and move away from that alignment has in reality been seen to be impossible if we want to maintain the relationship with our biggest trading partner. So the practicalities alone of the trade environment and the complexities associated with the Northern Ireland Protocol, the realities for the people living in Northern Ireland and in Ireland of having to deal with the uncertainty associated with that, the government has had no real choice but to accept that it will operate in this networked order where it has to cooperate and it has to cede certain issues. So I think we've also seen that shift because in reality, we haven't seen trade increase from outside the EU in the way that they were promising that it would. And in fact, we're probably more reliant now than ever before on our partners in the European Union countries.
Just got one paragraph to go, the conclusion, and then I really want to hear from other people and to see what questions there are. So just a conclusion. Sovereignty essentially is a difficult concept. It is prized by many, and I would argue misunderstood by many. Much of the government's rhetoric is based on absolutist conceptions of sovereignty, and that version is simply not fit to describe the government's actions as it seeks to develop its trade policy post-Brexit. That's particularly clear in relation to its global agenda, but I think it's also clear in relation to its relationship with the EU. There are signs in some of its actions that the UK government, like the EU, is focusing more on cooperation. But I think this is the main claim we wanted to make. The strength of the rhetoric around absolutist sovereignty, so the independence, the freedom from constraint, etc., has, I think, contributed to making it very difficult for progress to occur, and also looking forward for there to be much confidence in the way in which the trade agenda will develop. I think the sovereignty rhetoric which has been used to date is very, very powerful, and it would probably need something quite powerful to displace it and to enable us to move to a better place in the future. And that's it from me.
Thank you. That was a world-leading lecture and using a bit of rhetoric, but it was not fiction.
Sadly not.
It's fascinating that you know, we move from Brexit absolutist to COVID that is so isolationist in a way, but at the same time it shows that everything is relational, everything is linked with everything else. Just you mentioned trade. 5-6 years ago, there was a short trip to Melbourne to evaluate the project. And I met two of the trade negotiators of the Australian government. In the previous job, one was running the embassy in Kabul, and the other was running a couple of embassies in South America. Now, you can understand how they understand relationally, how they understand how everything is contextualized, and how easy it is for them to negotiate, irrespective of politics where they come from. How difficult sometimes is to deal with these negotiators from a British perspective. Well, we'll see where we are. And the challenge is how you simplify that, how you popularize that. I think this is important, so that's why I'm grateful to you as a citizen as well, is that you're trying to do that, you're trying to engage with the real world, apart from presenting something that is genuinely brilliant. So thank you. Questions, and then we thank you with an applause. Just have questions from the floor.
May I ask those of you in the room, when asking questions, could you please wait for the microphone so that those online can hear you properly? Thank you.
Good evening. Trevor Taylor, University of Law. In the discussion, the debates about sovereignty, wasn't there a lot of confusion or mixing together the concept of parliamentary sovereignty and the sovereignty of the United Kingdom as an actor on the international stage? And for those who focusing on parliamentary sovereignty, has the end of direct effect of EU law, apart from within the withdrawal agreement, met their arguments on parliamentary sovereignty ground?
We were very much focusing on the external side of sovereignty and the UK sovereignty rather than on parliamentary sovereignty. I think it's interesting that parliamentary sovereignty has disappeared from a lot of the government rhetoric, so that the government rhetoric on this seems to be much more focused on sovereignty and the way in which various aspects of the sort of Brexit process have been handled have involved significant sidelining of Parliament. So I think there is a discussion to be had in the internal context about parliamentary sovereignty versus kind of executive sovereignty and the government being able to do what it wants. But we've been looking at this very much from the external perspective rather than the internal perspective.
I think there's important interconnections between them as well. So we have, you know, one of the major challenges at the moment in the UK, I think, is that the external trade policy does not marry with the internal industrial policy. And part of the challenge there is that the regions have not really been able to influence policymakers' decision-making at central government level. And so you've seen, because, you know, trade is their competence. And so you've seen this kind of lack of sovereignty even within, you know, the national context as well. You know, the devolved administrations would like a much bigger say in what's happening because they represent their economic spaces. And so they are linked. And yes, whilst we didn't talk about that in a way, parliamentary sovereignty in the context of Brexit has been a real challenge because, as you say, they've conflated lots of different concepts into one narrative, and it's mystified lots of people, you know, in the general public as to what Brexit is about, what it means. And so actually a lot of areas require improvement, and that's why I hope the Department for Trade and Business will actually do that. But realistically, you know, we were focusing on the external dimension, but there's definitely a connection to the internal as well.
Thank you. John Taylor, I'm an honorary professor at Queen Mary University of London in CCLS and indeed had the great pleasure of working closely with Spiros when he was heading the CCLS. I'd have, please, just one quick comment before the question, if I may. I'm Australian and was reminded that our wonderful first speaker in presenting her thesis, her paper, was speaking to us at 4:15 a.m. her time. I'm not too sure whether many of us would be even awake at that time. So I'd like to thank her especially. It was great to listen to her, but at that hour of the morning, I think it should be recognized. My quick question, did you look in the course of your research and your paper, please, did you look at rule of law issues? The reason I ask that question is that relational aspects are so important, and thank you so much for your presentation, which shows this, and hope it is being listened to at the government level. But, you know, unless also the rule of law is observed, you know, relational aspects are just probably out the window. But just in way of a question.
It's not something that we addressed explicitly in the paper, but rule of law underpins everything in terms of the context of future trade agreements and current trade agreements and external policy. And I think there's actually a lot of work that could be done in that area to sort of really try to articulate what it means and what's currently happening. So again, highlight in the way that we have done with this paper around sovereignty, to showcase actually where we're seeing, you know, the rule of law possibly not being adhered to in the way or promoted in the way that one would expect. And I don't know if you want to add to that.
I agree completely. I agree it's a good question. The example that I mentioned just in passing was the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill and the feeling among the more absolutist sovereignty sort of bands that this was instrumental in leading to a positive conclusion with the Windsor framework. I think that's very wrong. And I think that there are all manner of dangers for the UK going forward if the government continues to take a sort of cavalier approach to the rule of law and to its treaty obligations. I think, I mean, the other obvious example at the moment is in relation to migration and the refugee conventions, etc. And I think it's difficult to sort of quantify just how significant the damage being done to the UK could be if this sort of style of engagement continues. And I don't know, should I be confident that it might be changing now? I'm not confident, but there are some signs that it might be.
Thank you. There's a question here.
Oh.
They start like a text.
Do you want to speak in here? Speak in this one.
No, no, we have questions. We have 1, 2, 3, and then we have 3 questions from there. Yeah.
We've been waiting.
A quick comment, first of all, is I'm here from Singapore in Asia, as opposed to Singapore on Thames, which the UK appears to want to try and become, even though they know nothing about Singapore, and it's a complete nonsense. I would have been perhaps slightly less polite than you were when you spoke about the fictions to do with sovereignty. I'd have said they were nonsense. But I appreciate that words are very powerful. And the word that everybody talks about, whether it's parliamentary or it's state, is sovereignty. And do you have any suggestion about what the alternative word that should be used and we try to popularize to make people understand the issues better than they do about that awful word sovereignty?
I'm wary of abandoning sovereignty and to people who badly misinterpret it. So I think there is some value, I hope there's some value in challenging absolutist versions of sovereignty. I think that what we have in mind is something which is perhaps closer to sort of power and influence in the world. And if you couch it in terms of ways in which one can seek to maximize one's power and influence in the world, I think one gets to a very different endpoint to what one does if one starts with absolutist sovereignty. The EU is quite explicit about that and talks about becoming a sort of a global power. I can't remember now what the quote was that the Ursula von der Leyen used, but it was in that context. And I think if you focus too much on power, that is also problematic, and it shows that you're trying to trample over the rest of the world, or it could be read as trying to trample over the rest of the world. So I'm thinking as I'm speaking, I'm not coming up with a particularly better formulation, but those are my thoughts.
We ran a campaign a couple of years ago, reimagining the law. We will now do reimagining sovereignty.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
we have one there, one here, and then 2 from the audience from.
Hi, yes, well, I've worked a lot on EU law issues, and it does occur to me that even at the EU level, there's a lot of fiction around the sovereignty thing. So in particular, they're more in recent years, more recent concept of maximum harmonization and how that actually works in practice, because you know, you're looking at a particular piece of legislation or involved in legislating it or trying to, and it says this directive or regulation contains, you know, is subject to maximum harmonization insofar as it contains harmonized provisions. And this is a common problem with EU law, because then you think, well, it isn't actually telling you which are the harmonized provisions. So it ducks the issue. There are lots of examples at the EU level. You know, there are obviously clear competencies within the Lisbon Treaty and all the rest of it, but leaving that aside, there are issues of ducking sovereignty where people are none the wiser after many years. And as we know, many member states just ignore things if they don't want to do them. And that is still very much a problem in practice. And that, you know, coming back to the rule of law thing, you know, other countries don't necessarily have the same approach to things actually happening the way they are supposed to happen. And then in the UK context, I know this is more an internal point, but I did wonder what the panel thought about the retained EU law bill currently going through Parliament, which hasn't got quite as much publicity as the Windsor Agreement. But, you know, in terms of sovereignty fictions, there's an amendment being put in the House of Lords, which is called the Sovereignty Amendment, because it aims to stop things being repealed by accident, which is one of the main consequences. I don't know if anyone's had any joy of making themselves familiar with the Cabinet Office dashboard recently, but you know, they've got thousands and thousands of pieces of legislation in there that are technically retained EU law, and they acknowledge publicly that there are thousands more that they just don't know exist. So this idea of regulation by accident, I mean, coming back to rule of law and internal, sorry, how can that possibly be sovereign if things just don't happen as they're supposed to? And I'm very minded of debates, you know, back 15, 20 years ago about the concept of intelligent regulation. You know, what happened to the concept of intelligent regulation, where things actually, you know, set out what they were going to do, explained it clearly, and then actually went ahead and did it and also enforced it. So much of law these days is simply not enforced.
I mean, I agree with absolutely everything you just said. So I'm not sure I can really add to that, apart from say that, you know, we certainly weren't trying to put the EU as a model of good, as a good example of sovereignty. It's more to just sort of illustrate where the UK is claiming that it's changing its position, but in reality really isn't, whilst acknowledging the differences in their approaches. And I think the real concern around the UK's future, well, present and future interactions with other countries in these spaces is that it simply doesn't really know what it's doing. That's my main concern. You've got government departments, you know, if you go back to this idea of you met the trade negotiators, well, actually, they're only in their seats for a few years before they move on to a new seat. And so it's whether we've got that intelligence within, you know, these teams to actually enable us to have that memory of what we've done before and what's relevant. In terms of the EU is itself a contradiction. Externally, it promotes certain things that internally it absolutely turns a blind eye to. We require other countries to, you know, the EU requires other countries to uphold certain standards that internally its member states do not. So the EU itself is a very interesting actor to study, but is full of contradictions and hypocrisies in my view.
Thank you.
Best for the last. My name is Kavita Mohanty. I'm an LLM graduate from Cambridge. I'll keep it brief, Professor. In your presentation, you mentioned how in the current scenario, UK is trying to have trade relations with controversial partners. You furthermore also mentioned that EU is significant at the point and you haven't seen any trade increase with other partners. Do you not believe it's going to take time given the depth of relation with the EU in, like, you know, the last few decades? And secondly, if we were to move away from the academic debate that we're having at this point, in terms of practicality, what is a suggestion that you would make as a policymaker to make sure that you can maneuver through with controversial partners because they're out of the EU, so to speak? So those are the two questions, and thank you.
Yeah, great questions. Thank you very much. In terms of, I'll take the second part first. The UK, there's been a really interesting shift, and it kind of ties in actually with the question that's coming online. There's been a really interesting shift in the UK's external trade policy over the past 12 months, and most recently 6 months, which is that there is a decoupling of trade and human rights. So there is a proactive shift away from having human rights within trade agreements. Human rights will form part of the negotiation and political side agreements. Thank you. So that in itself will then enable the UK to exercise its sovereignty to then have these trading partnerships that perhaps are considered to be controversial. We are seeing some of those countries having more significance in terms of UK market entry and in terms of import-export destinations. So does it take time? Absolutely. But should we be rushing agreements through that typically take decades to negotiate? No, we should be taking our time, because actually, as we're navigating this post-Brexit space, and we know that the EU markets are still our main markets, you know, we have also the US and China and India, but really the EU is still our sort of bread and butter in terms of trade. So we need to kind of focus, I think, that they should be taking their time to focus on what the core values are that the UK is aiming to achieve, and thinking, I suppose, to that sort of very basic question of what is the purpose of the trade relationship. If it's about expanding markets and about market liberalization, go sign an agreement with whoever you want. But if it's to become a soft superpower, which is what the UK is saying it wants to become, then a far more nuanced approach to its negotiations needs to happen, I think.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions online and one that's more of a comment, I think. The comment is from David Snoxall. He said, a good example of the shift in the UK's sovereignty rhetoric is the current negotiations announced on the 3rd of November between the UK and Mauritius over the sovereignty of the Chagos Islands based on international law. And he's followed up saying, in the Chagos context, in reality, the UK has control over the British Indian Ocean territory. Sovereignty actually belongs to Mauritius, yet for 58 years, the UK has claimed sovereignty. I wonder if either of you would like to respond to that agreement. Yeah. We then have a question over whether absolutist sovereignty is actually what we really need to be talking about here, from Andrew Surdy. He said he invites you to comment on the proposition that the problem is not that absolutist sovereignty is the wrong conception, but rather that hardly anybody, the EU possibly itself included when talking of pooling sovereignty, understands that sovereignty is actually a negative concept, the absence of something, namely a higher authority than whoever or whatever is sovereign. It can thus be used to create voluntarily by treaty an entity that, like the EU, is given the power to override or act to the exclusion of its member states. And to that limited extent, for it's infinitely divisible, sovereignty is indeed lost by joining the EU and regained by leaving it. Decision-making or regulatory power as a positive concept can thus be pooled, but sovereignty cannot.
Yeah.
I mean, I try to express that I'm not sure that sovereignty is the right language to use for this. And I think the motivation for the article is the power and the strength of the absolutist version of sovereignty as constantly promulgated by the UK government. I think there probably are better ways of trying to see what's going on. And I totally take the point that sovereignty can be seen as having very negative connotations. I think in the debate in the UK, it has been seen as pretty much an unalloyed positive. And what we should be doing is trying to maximize our sovereignty in various ways and ensure that we are free from various constraints. And I think, yes, I basically agree. I think there is something to be said for those points.
Thank you. And from Tom Appleby, he says, first off, wonderful to see co-authorship in a legal paper. Too often we're solo operators. He says, lots of potential questions, but what do you think would happen if the UK tries to exit the European Convention on Human Rights? I think, Claire, you indicated you'd be willing to take that.
So, I mean, this is something I feel very passionate about. My area of expertise is actually trade and human rights. So the idea that we would be in a country that would exit that convention is deeply problematic from a very personal perspective. I think this ties in with points about rule of law. It ties in with points about what is the UK as an actor and what values is it trying to promote externally. And I think that there should be a very, very careful thought about this before there's any further action to withdraw from the convention. I think it signals a very serious regression from the values that are apparently the founding values of the UK.
And just to respond to what the consequences would be, I think is extremely difficult to work out. I think they would be adverse, and it would make it more difficult for the UK to seek to do the things it is trying to do with its trade agenda. The idea of getting global soft power at the same time as abandoning something like the European Convention on Human Rights, I think is very, very problematic and very difficult.
Yes, I would agree with you on that. I think we had a few more questions in the room.
Yeah.
Ronnie Carty, I want to make 2 points. One may appear a bit facetious. I live half of the time in Germany and half the time in London, and I love British sausages and British chocolate, and I can't find them anywhere in Germany. So in what sense is the European Union the primary source of British trade? I mean, do the British sausages go to Australia, or did they go to America, or they just eat them all ourselves? I'm connected to that. I think that I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed the talk, and I sympathize with the whole drift of it, but we are probably all talking to the converted here, and it seems to me there is, and I'm still on my first facetious point, it seems to me still that the study of foreign languages, as far as I'm aware, in Britain, at both the school and university level, is very seriously threatened and in full retreat. And I was at an embassy reception about a week ago and astonished to find that nobody on the Foreign Office desk for Central and Northern Europe who was at the reception, could speak any foreign languages. And to my mind, this gap, there is a huge cultural gap. I mean, I came back from Berlin about a year ago, and I thought, well, I'd like to continue reading continental newspapers. And I went into Google and I found there were a whole pile of newspaper agencies in central London selling foreign newspapers, but they've all gone bust. And it's really, you can only get stuff online. And there is this, to my mind, there is a drift in consciousness away from Europe, which is underlying the whole Brexit process. And that one can't really laugh away with some economic theories about trade. I mean, as the lady from India suggested, maybe we just need time. Britain needs time to develop its trading relations with other countries. But as I say, no Cadbury's chocolate and no Tesco's sausages in Berlin.
Don't have chocolate. So
Sorry?
It's at what cost, right? I completely agree with what you're saying, but I think the challenge is, I think that's a really interesting point around a drift of consciousness away from the EU.
Yeah.
But by the same token, if you're talking about why businesses have gone bust, they've gone bust because the UK didn't manage Brexit in the way that it should have managed it. And it didn't manage it because it didn't listen to people. We as academics and policymakers,
Oh, yeah, I agree.
We're telling them, if you don't get this regulation in place, customs is going to be a problem. You need trade facilitation.
Oh, I agree with you completely that the people in the government don't know what they're doing, and are not equipped to know what they're doing.
Saying,
Yeah.
I agree that businesses have gone bust, and that's a problem. But in taking time, what else do we lose whilst we're waiting?
Well, my solution is just to emigrate to Berlin. I mean, I think it's... But my second point is a technical one. I mean, after the First World War, the Vienna School of International Law, which consisted of two Jewish scholars, Kunz and Kelsen, decided that the concept of sovereignty had to be eradicated from international law. It was one of the main reasons for the slaughter. So, and I think their views are largely reflected in continental European textbooks on international law. And the word sovereignty is dropped, and it's not there. And you have Kelsen's idea that we have an international legal order, and it grants certain competences to states, and then some competences to the international order. So it's the notion of competence, I know a level of competence that's determined by a community standard is what is then reflected in legal structures. And so sovereignty, with all the problematic connections it has with deity and divinity and magical aspects of it, which is what Kelsen and Kunz were struggling against, has just simply been eliminated and is not there. I don't think it's anywhere in the German constitution. You have the idea of legal order and within that, the idea of human rights. So they have moved on. I think you can't do anything with the concept of sovereignty itself is toxic from the point of view of having any kind of relational order. I mean, I like very much your lecture on the talk about recognition and relationship and all the rest of it. So the weakness of that is that it's still a kind of state of nature concept. It's still horizontally different countries recognizing one another up to a point, and maybe not recognizing and misrecognizing one another. I'm sorry?
Relational.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, can I say one thing about the sort of global order and the Kelsenian kind of approach? This is not preaching to the converted, but my sense is that in the last 20 years or so, that has taken something of a hit, and that more and more countries, governments around the world seem to be asserting their rights to go alone and questioning the constraints which a global order might impose on them. And so I think we're possibly in quite dangerous territory now, where states are emboldened and don't feel constrained by international frameworks in a way that I think is different to what it was, say, 20 years ago. And I think possibly the resurgence of the sovereignty language in the UK is just an illustration of that very much wider trend, and quite where the global order goes from here, I think is a little bit difficult to work out. So the WTO is suffering a lot at the moment. I don't think anyone has particular confidence in the way the UN and the UN Security Council operates. And so a lot of the pillars of the sort of post-war global order are under threat. And I don't know what the answer to that is, other than that we should be aware of that. Yeah.
Thank you.
We need to have some positive questions, because Liam was out giving bottles of wine rather than.
Yeah, well, we might say, yeah. I'll ask one.
Thanks so much. I'm Oliver, I'm at the LSE, and I'm wholly convinced by your plea to abolish sovereignty and political rhetoric. I want to pick up on the conversation around what do we replace sovereignty with from a legal perspective. It seems analytically you kind of already have in your analysis, because you talk about space, regulatory space. So I was wondering perhaps what you mean. Could you flesh out that concept of regulatory space? Is it simply dominated by asymmetric power relations? Because on this final point about getting rid of sovereignty, perhaps in legal thinking, there may be good reasons why sovereignty crept back into international law, mainly associated with formal decolonization, as the Chagos question alluded to, and maybe issues around natural resources and so forth. So space, what is regulatory space?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a great question. And I think that we should preface it by saying we're talking about sovereignty in a very specific context in our paper. And so I think that I wouldn't necessarily advocate for abandoning the term sovereignty. I think it carries a lot of different meanings, and we need to unpack those meanings, which is part of what we try to do here. For me, regulatory space is that expression of a country's ability to determine what it includes and excludes, what it can have within its space, what it doesn't have within its space. And that requires cooperation. That by its very nature needs to have that sort of element, that relational aspect with another country. And it revolves around cooperation of different stakeholders. So that regulatory space is not just the state. That space is actually comprised of different actors working within that space to define what it means and to set the limits of what it means. I don't want to end on a negative note, but the problem with regulatory space is that it is comprised of lots of different actors, and that in itself has power asymmetries, because those actors who have the most money and the most influence are the ones whose voices get heard. And so then the regulatory space starts to be dictated by big business, who have particular lobbying interests, for example, and can then influence government decisions. So then you see the shift of power moving even further from central government towards other actors. So regulatory space in itself is problematic from a sovereignty point of view, because we see that shift of power. Can it be positive? Absolutely. I think it's much better that you've got more stakeholders involved in determining that the delimited space that we're dealing with here. But there are definite dangers and risks in that as well.
We do have one more comment from online, so you may not need to end on that.
I think so.
Yes, this from Angus Johnston, who says that the re-emergence of national sovereignty arguments as signs of a wider trend might indeed be seen to be reflected in some of the challenges to EU law's doctrine of primacy in the highest courts of the various EU member states, as well as the populist national administrations in some such member states and their attitude towards EU law. The German Constitutional Court's recent challenge to EU law seems to have emboldened politicians in numerous other member states, echoing the point made concerning the possible UK withdrawal from the ECHR and the UK losing its influence and position. Such moves made for domestic reasons can have difficult and distressing international consequences. Perhaps not that much more positive.
Thank you so much.
I hadn't read to the end of the comment.
I mean, I agree, it's really challenging. And I think that it all has to be situated in its historical context and its evolving context. And since 2007, life has been pretty hard, right? From the first major financial crisis until now, we've been going back and forth through recessions, through periods of austerity. And that, in effect, has enabled, I think, in part, this absolutist narrative of sovereignty to take hold. And then when you couple that with those really important points being raised around, you know, the challenges to primacy in the EU, it's ended up creating this very toxic mix that has enabled a very reductivist, a very simplistic and factually wrong narrative to really take hold. And that is deeply troubling. I'm not sure that's a really positive note to end on either. So sorry about that.
I do have a positive note for us to end on. There is wine at the back of the room. Thank you both once again for a fantastic evening and a great article that spurred it all on. And thank you all for being such a great audience and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.